Welcome everyone today to the Farm Bureau Farmtastic Adventures Apple Google Hangout. My name is Rachel Scoble and I'm here today with my classmates Abby Van Tyne and Tanya Burgos Hernandez. This afternoon, we're happy to have Anita Cook here with us, who is the Organization Director for Cuyahoga County Farm Bureau. She is actually going to be our videographer today. Jennifer Barnett, who's the Office Administrator for Jefferson County Farm Bureau, is also serving as our Tech Coordinator, as many of you have heard her already this afternoon. Our guest today is Bruce Grayson. He is from North Royalton, Ohio, and now let's welcome our classroom and teachers to the Hangout. As I recognize your classroom, please give us a little wave so we can see who you are. First, Miss Emily Adams class from Winster Trail in Franklin County, Ohio. Welcome.
Caleb, sit down.
From North Elementary in Jefferson County is Miss Erin Best class. Welcome. And then from Port Washington Elementary is Kirk Glacier's class. Okay, and then from Miss Jennifer Hardacre's class, they're from Dansville Elementary School in Clark County. We also have two new schools with us today. We have one new school and two classes from Sand Valley. We have Miss Saddock's class and Miss Craver's class. We also have Miss Lomas's class and Miss Blackford's class. Welcome to you all. Hopefully your classroom has had a chance to watch the Apple video and read through the Apple Ag Mag. Mr. Grayson will spend a little time sharing with you his experience of the apple growers, and then the classrooms will have an opportunity to ask questions. So let's get started. Mr. Grayson will turn the floor over to you.
Thank you. My name is Bruce Grayson, and our farm is called Royalton Farms. I have about 6 acres of apple trees, 1,000 trees in the apple business. That's not very big, but it's plenty of work for us. We started about 30 years ago. My father asked if I was interested in moving out here, as at that point in time nobody was living here. My wife and I did move out here, and nothing was here at the time. My grandfather did plant about 60 apple trees back in the 1950s, and most of those trees are getting pretty overgrown. I renovated them. It took a while to do that, and we started getting apples off of them, and we were very happy with that. But they were bigger trees, so we wanted to start planting newer varieties, trees that were called semi-dwarfs. They only get 12, 15 feet high. They're a lot easier to take care of. So we started planting trees in about the mid-1980s. We planted a couple of hundred trees, and then every couple of years we planted a couple of hundred more trees. But we started getting into trees called dwarf trees that only get about 10 to 12 feet high but are much narrower. We like dwarf trees because they're just so much easier to take care of. We did end up cutting down most of the old trees that my grandfather planted just because they were getting over mature or just getting too old to yield apples. But we're pretty happy with the younger trees we have now. As you can see behind me are some Golden Delicious and some Empire, the redder apples to your left. And then off to the right over here are some other dwarf trees we have. They're behind a fence right now because we have a big deer problem. And the deer love to eat the trees and the fruit. So we put a fence up around some of the young trees we have. This is a family business for us. My wife and I raised our 2 daughters here. Both my daughters helped during apple season. And our busy time of the year is harvest. As on any farm, anything that's being grown, harvest time is the time of the year when you put in your longest days. In the summer or in the winter time is when we start taking care of the apple trees. In the winter, I do pruning. The trees need to be dormant or sleeping, and we go in and we thin the trees out. We don't want them to get too thick. It is better for the apples that way. And then I spend most of January, February, and into March doing thinning or pruning. Come the end of March, we're cleaning everything up. And then into April, I start spraying the trees to protect the trees and protect the fruit from insects and diseases. And then in the summertime, we're still spraying and we're mowing a lot of grass. And then as the season goes on, we're getting ready. I'm constantly monitoring the fruit, checking to see how it's doing. Do I have any particular problems out there? And one of the problems we had this year is we had so many blossoms on the trees. The bees did such a wonderful job of pruning all those blossoms that we had way too many fruit on the trees. The trees were overloaded. And the problem with that is many of the apples will come out like golf balls, the size of a golf ball, because there's too many on the tree. The tree can't sustain all of them. So most of this summer, my daughter, her job was to thin the trees. And she didn't thin all 1,000 trees, but she probably thinned 400 to 500 trees. And that's basically picking the little apples off. They would be anywhere from the size of a dime to the size of a quarter. And she probably spent almost 2 months doing that by hand. And by the end of that time, she was pretty tired of dropping apples on the ground, but she did a good job. And then come September, it's time to start picking the apples and selling them in our farm market. When we pick the apples, we pick them into very large bins, 18 bushel bins. They hold about 700 pounds of apples. I think Anita here will give you a shot of that. Picking apples is a lot of work. It usually takes about 1 to 2 hours to pick this bin of apples right here. When the apples get picked, we bring the bins in, and then we usually we usually put them in the cooler right away to get them cold as possible. And then when we're ready, we sort the apples. We put them on an apple washer. It brushes, puts water on them, sprays water on them, and then the brushes clean the apples. And then we have a crew. In our case, we use high school kids that have been friends with my daughters, and they come in on weekends, and they'll spend a couple hours going through bins. Usually in about 3 hours, we can go through 4 or 5 bins of apples, and we grade the apples. Just like at school, you have to take tests and you get graded. Here, our apples get graded, and apples are graded according to whether they're a marketable apple, one that you would eat, or an apple that has a blemish on it that we can put that apple into cider, or if it has a hole in it, we just throw those apples out. We throw them out to the deer. And the holes could be in the apple from hail damage. It could be from birds. Birds sit at the top of the tree and they'll peck at the apples and put a hole in them, and then the apple will start to rot. So we discard those apples. When we're done grading those apples, everything goes back into the cooler until we're ready to use them. And then throughout the week, we will haul apples up to our farm market, and that's where we sell all our apples. We do very little to no wholesaling. We pretty much sell everything right here on the farm. My daughters, I mentioned before, grew up here. They've both gone off to college and moved on. But when they were growing up, they were always here working on the farm. They helped pick apples, they helped grade apples, they watched the market, took care of the market, waited on customers, pretty much did everything. They also ran our machinery. They moved the bins around. They didn't do it a lot, but they did a great job when they did it. So,
what kind of apples do you grow?
We grow 15 different varieties of apples. Our apples start to come due at September 1st, and the last apple we pick is around the 15th to the 20th of October. And we don't want all our apples to come due at one time because it would just be overwhelming. But as the season goes on, we usually start picking a different variety every 5 days. Sometimes we'll have 2 or 3 varieties come due on the same date. So like October 5th, Empire, Golden Delicious, and Melrose were starting to come due at the same time. So we just start picking a little bit of each one of them just to get them out on the shelves. But we do grow a lot of different varieties. Prima is our first apple. It is a disease-resistant apple. We like this apple because we don't have to spray it as much. Other apples we have are Macintosh, Honeycrisp, Gala apples, a good eating apple, sweet apple, Jonathan's, Cortland's, Empire, Golden Delicious, Fuji apples, Red Delicious. Let's see what else do we have. Empire, Melrose, Winesap, Mutsu. So that's predominantly what it is. So we could probably grow other varieties, but right now we're just sticking with what we have because that's what people like. If a new variety comes out, I will try it. The last new variety I planted was Honeycrisp 3-4 years ago, and I'm really glad I did that because that's a fantastic apple.
What's the most popular apple people buy?
At this point in time, it's Honeycrisp, and I think that's because it's a newer variety. But all our apples sell. Our old varieties are Macintosh, Jonathan, Cortland. Those are apple varieties that have been around for over 100 years. We have a lot of older folks who always remember growing up with those apples, and that's the apple they want. Younger folks, they really don't know those apples because they're used to the newer apples like Gala, Golden Delicious, Honeycrisp, Fuji's. Those are all sweet eating apples, which young folks they usually like that apple the most. I can't say we have one favorite apple here.
Besides apples, what else do you sell in your market?
During the fall, we sell pumpkins and corn stalks. Early in the season, in September, our season, we sell vegetables like tomatoes and cucumbers, zucchinis. Sometimes we get into squash, but we usually don't do a lot of vegetables. We're very fall-oriented in what we do.
I know you have another business besides the apples and the apple orchard. What is that?
My other mainstay in my business is landscaping. I got into that when I went to college. I got a degree in forestry. I didn't have an opportunity to get into the forest industry. My dad offered me the opportunity to move out here live on the farm, and that's what I did, and that's when I started my landscaping business. I looked at the property, which is 55 acres, as a natural resource, and I love natural resources in general, so I wanted to move out here and start to utilize the property. I started growing shrubbery and trees, predominantly for my business, my landscaping business, but I also sell to the public if somebody comes in and sees what I have and they want to buy something. It's just convenient for me in my landscaping business because I have everything right here.
Do you do school tours here at the farm?
We used to do school tours for North Royalton. In fact, my older daughter, when she was in kindergarten, her first school tour, her first field trip was to go to an apple orchard, and she just happened to come home to go on that field trip. She was kind of saddened by that because I did abuse her a little bit verbally, just because she's my daughter, and I picked on her a little bit, but she took it all in stride, and we had a good time with that. But yeah, we used to do school tours. North Royalton hasn't done them in a number of years here because of their limited budget. They went to, I think, the farm park, Lake County Farm Park is where they ended up going up there.
I see you also offer hay rides on weekends.
On Saturdays and Sundays, we have about a mile's worth of trails up in the back. It goes through fields. We go through the woods in a number of areas. We only do that when the weather permits. Hopefully that'll be this weekend too. But it gives an opportunity for people we're very much right on the edge of the city. We're only 20 miles outside of Cleveland. So we do get some folks coming from the urban areas and they want to get out and just take a ride. It's quiet.
I see that the cider press is not working right now, but do you want to walk us through that to see how that?
Sure. We
All those
pressed
machinery
cider yesterday. My dad and I have been doing it for about 25 years. We bring apples in right over here. This is a press cloth. We'll talk about this in a minute. But we put the apples on. This is called an elevator. And we put the apples on here, and it takes it up to the top over here. The apples fall into this shiny apparatus called the grinder. And this thing's spinning very quickly. This is the loudest part of the whole operation. But it grinds all the apples up into a wet, sloppy mash. Think of wet mashed potatoes. It all falls into this hopper right here, and we can fill this up. And then it gets pumped over through this blue tube into this clear tube. We pump it over here to the cider press. Our cider press is about 45 to 50 years old, and it is how cider presses have always been. This is sort of old technology. It is still used today, but it's called a rack and cloth system. And these are racks. And these racks go on this tray over here. And we have a form we put on top, and we put the cloth in. It's called rack and cloth. And the mash, the apple mash, gets put in here into a form, and then we fold this up, and then we put another tray on top, and we build layers. And the layers, we get it about this high when we're done, and it's approximately 400 pounds of apples. And then we slide it over to where the press is, and we start to press it. It's a somewhat slow process. It takes about 10 to 12 minutes to do one pressing. When we do that pressing, the entire time apple cider is falling off this tray over here. And we get approximately 30 gallons out of each one of our pressings each time we do this. Yesterday we made about 270 to 290 gallons of cider for the week. We'll sell that over the weekend. We do not pasteurize our cider. We do not put preservatives in our cider. It's pretty much old-fashioned cider. How your parents drank it when they grew up. We love making cider. The reason why I decided to start pressing cider for our orchard is I wanted to have control over the quality of the product we're making. We used to go to another cider press that did what was called custom pressing. They pressed everybody else's cider, other small farms in the area, and we didn't necessarily have control over the apples that were being put into that press before us. They could have used bad apples that would have contaminated our cider, or contaminated the equipment than our cider. So we just wanted to have better control over the product. Also, it allows us, if we run out of cider, say on a Sunday or a Monday, we can press cider on Tuesday. We can do it ourselves instead of running to the custom press, which was about 25 miles. So we were able to do everything right here in-house. My dad and I have been doing all the pressing for the past 25 years.
So when you collect all these apples, you harvest them, where do you put them?
Well, we have to keep the apples cold. The colder we keep the apples, the longer they'll last. I'm just going to get this up and use it. Ready? So when we used to do school tours, I would ask the kids, do you have a refrigerator at home? And most kids have a refrigerator at home. Well, I would always take the kids into my refrigerator. So we'll take a short walk, and we'll go behind the door here. It'll be a little bit loud because there's a fan running, so we won't spend too much time inside. But this is my refrigerator. These apples in the bins are what have been harvested already. As you can see, we have quite a bit here. The apples in the small crates are ready for market. They're ready to sold. And then everything else in the milk crates we use for cider. That's how we, then I can mix the different varieties. This is our product that we sell right here for up at the front in our market. These are little quarts we have for sale. And we also do pints, half gallons, and gallons.
I think it might be time for some questions.
Okay.
All right, so we're at the portion now where we're going to ask our classrooms to ask some questions, okay? When it's your turn to ask your questions, make sure you speak loudly into the mic so Mr. Grayson can hear you, okay? So the following classes will get about one question per rotation. Miss Adams, Miss Hardacre, Mr. Glazer, and Miss Best. And then Loomis and Blackford and Sedlak and Carver, you're going to get 2 questions per rotation, okay? If your audio isn't working, then you can also type your question too so we can read it that way. So without any further ado, we're going to start with Miss Adams' class.
When apples change color, is it with chlorophyll, like leaves, or is it another thing?
Apples get their color mostly from sunshine, but they do not have chlorophyll in them. Only green leaves have chlorophyll. Apples, it's a genetic thing. This is a Melrose. You can see it's pretty red here, but on the other side it's going to be fairly green. And most of that is, I think you could probably more equate it to like a suntan. These apples that are much more green were probably inside the center of the tree and didn't get as much sunshine to them. The other thing that also helps with color on apples is air temperature. Apples are really cool season fruit. They don't grow apples down in Alabama. They do have 1 or 2 varieties they can't grow down there, but they're not real prominent. They're a northern climate fruit because they do much better here. They like cool weather, and they get better color on them if it's cooler out. But it also has to do with sunshine. That's one of the reasons why we prune or thin the apple trees. We want to pull branches out of the way because the trees will get too thick, and then we'll have too much of this and not enough of this. So they do need sunshine for that respect. But the sun does not, it's not a chlorophyll issue.
All right, next we have Miss Hardacre's class.
The world.
I think we need to repeat the question one more time.
How much apples are in the world?
How many apples are in the world?
I have no idea what that number is, but it probably is in the billions. As far as trees, if you're considering trees, Washington State has the biggest, largest number of trees in the United States, probably followed by New York and then Michigan and Pennsylvania. A place like China, they are very dominant in the apple world. People don't think about China and apples, but it was reported a while ago that China was doubling their apple production every 2 years. That's how they were growing fruit. But they also have a very large population to feed.
All right, next is Mr. Glazer's class.
I want to know if all apples are edible.
As far as I know of, I sure hope all apples are edible. Yeah, all apples are edible.
All right, next is Mrs. Best's class.
What is your favorite apple to make cider?
To make cider, we don't use one particular apple to make cider. In fact, we have a rule to we will only make cider when we have at least 3 different kinds of apples. Blending is the best thing for cider. The more varieties, the better. The one issue we do have, though, is early in the season, we have to have at least 1 sweet apple, and a lot of them, to make the apple cider taste sweet. If we used all Macintosh, the cider would be tart. So in the spring, so in September, early September, we're almost always waiting for Gala apples to ripen, because Gala is the #1 apple we use the first half of September, because it's the only sweet apple early on. But at this time of the season, I probably have at least 10 varieties of apples in my cider.
All right, next we have Mrs. Loomis and Miss Blackford's class. I think you guys were muted for your question. There we go.
Hey, how long does it take to make apple cider?
The process doesn't take us very long. We do not have a very big apple press in the business. We also don't have the smallest one, but we can make in about 3 hours, we can make about 250 to 300 gallons of cider. It really depends on how big the press is. Once again, ours is not a real big press. I would call ours a small to medium-sized press. I know I have acquaintances who have big cider presses. They can make probably 120 to 150 gallons in an hour.
Okay, thank you.
All right, and then you get one more question too.
All right, we have them ready.
When were apples founded?
Well, that's a good question. I know that the history of cider, humans have been drinking cider for 400 years, at least 400 years, which means there's been apples for at least 400 years. I would probably have to say that apples have been around for a very long time. I think rumor has it Adam and Eve had to deal with apples back in history. So I'm not going to go into that, but that just goes to show you it's a long time.
All right, next we have Mrs. Sedlak and Miss Carver's class.
What is the main apple for apple cider? What is the main type of apple for apple cider?
Here's the second.
What is the main type of apple for apple cider?
Once again, we don't use one variety of apple. We use as many varieties as we can possibly get together and throw in the bunch. Once again, the more different kinds of apples we use, the better the cider is. So that being said, our cider is very good in September, but by the end of October, when all the different varieties have been harvested, the cider gets much better as the season goes on.
All right, and then you get your second question.
How many seeds are usually in one apple?
How many seeds are in one apple?
I think there's 5.
All right, and then we're going to go back to Miss Adams' class.
How many apples are in a gallon?
A gallon of cider? Well, I have to think about that one for a minute, because sometimes it depends on if we have apples this big or apples this big. So there's a lot of variability in that. But I will go and say this. A bushel of apples weighs approximately 40 pounds. Out of that 40 pounds of apples, we usually average 3 to 3.5 gallons of cider out of 40 pounds. So maybe your teacher could use that question in math class on a test. And you can figure out how many gallons or how many pounds of apples are in 1 gallon.
All right, next is Miss Hardacre's class.
Go ahead. Go ahead.
How much apple cider do you think that you make in a month?
In how long?
In a month.
In a month? Well, our season is basically about 2 months long. About the middle of September to the middle of November is when we make cider. We're not that big of an orchard. And I know we average between 2,500 and 3,000 gallons of cider in that 2 months.
All right, next is Mr. Glazer's class.
Henry.
And ours are so bitter. Why? How do you get them to make it so? That's what.
When you showed us that big refrigerator, how long do you usually keep the apples and the apple cider in there before you ship them out?
Some of those apples will stay in there. Our first apple we pick is called Prima. We usually pick it by the 1st of September. We will have Primas in there until we sell out, and that will usually be by the end of October. So about 2 months period. We only stay open until we sell everything we have, and that's usually sometime in November.
How long can you keep an apple in refrigeration?
Well, refrigeration is one type of storage of apples. There are basically only 2 kinds of storage. One is refrigeration. Most times commercially, apples can be kept in refrigeration until around December to January. We hold on to apples for our family up to into February. They'll hold for us. The other type of storage is called controlled atmosphere storage. And basically what the growers do is they take they have very large refrigeration units that are the size of this barn. They put many bins of apples in there, and then they seal the room off, and they pull out all the oxygen out of the room, and they can store those apples for over a year. And when they pull those apples out, they will still be crunchy. They will still be hard. Most people think that they tend to lose their flavor after that point in time, but there's not many other vegetables or fruits on the market that you can keep for a year. The advantage to that is you have apples available all year round. When your parents were growing up, when your grandparents were growing up, they only had apples from September into December. And then the season was over because there was no other way to store the apples for long periods of time. What I also want to get at, though, is when you go to the grocery store in July and August to buy apples, apples are all harvested one time in the year, that's September and October. So when you buy an apple in July at the grocery store, it was harvested back in October or September. So you have to remember that.
All right, next we have Miss Best's class.
Why don't you sell the apples with holes to hunters? Wouldn't you make more money?
I didn't understand the whole
To
question.
sell the apples with holes to hunters, probably to entice the...
We do that. We call them deer apples. We can't sell all the deer apples because sometimes they're just a little too rotted, but we do use those blemished apples, and we'll bag them up in boxes. And in the past, I have more hunters asking me for deer apples than the deer apples that I have. In other words, the demand for it is much higher than what I have. My crop this year was very clean. I don't have a lot of cider apples, and I definitely don't have a lot of deer apples.
All right, next is Mrs. Loomis and Miss Blackbird's class.
Okay, she's coming. Have fun. So crafty.
How long?
Maddie, why don't you go?
How long does it take an apple tree to grow?
Well, when we get apple trees, when we buy the tree, it's probably about 3 to 4 feet high, and it's probably a 2-year-old tree. When we get the tree, we put it in the ground. We have to take care of it. We'll fertilize it, make sure it has plenty of water when it's dry out. From that point on, the older trees that are called semi-dwarf trees, they get a little bit bigger. They usually take anywhere from 3 to 5 years before they start having apples. However, the newer trees that we call dwarf trees, they will start yielding apples in 2 to 3 years after we plant them. So they will only be 4 to 5 years old from the time they were grown from either a seed or a cutting. That's very impressive. We like that because we don't have to wait as long before we can start getting the crop.
All right, and then your second question.
How does grafting work?
Did you hear her?
Yes.
Yes. Boy, that was a great question. Grafting, I don't do grafting. We let the nurserymen do the grafting. But grafting is basically taking the root of a plant, and they take a cutting or a small young branchlet off of an apple tree, and there's a way of carving it and making a joint. And it's sort of like taking something like this and putting them together. And then they wrap that so it doesn't dry out. And when they wrap it, it keeps it nice and moist. They may even use a gel, almost like Vaseline, to keep it nice and moist. And then they put it in nice, moist soil. And it's very important that they help the root system. And just like when you get a cut or a scrape on your hand, your skin grows back over that area. The same thing happens with that graft. When they put the two pieces together, the skin, the bark will grow over it, and it'll heal, and then it just starts growing. That's a very good question.
All right, we have time for 2 more questions, so we're going to go to Mrs. Sedlak and Miss Carver's class.
What is the favorite apple for apple pie?
That's a very interesting question. I get asked that question all the time when I'm in our farm market. The problem with that question is I don't make apple pie. I don't produce the apple pie. I consume apple pie. My wife produces the apple pie. But I do know from my wife that her favorite apple happens to be Melrose for pie. Melrose, by the way, is a variety that was developed at Ohio State University, and it's actually Ohio's state apple. Be careful, this might be a test question, but a Melrose is a cross between a sweet Red Delicious and a tart Jonathan apple. Both apples have been around for a very, very long time, and at Ohio State, they were able to cross the two together and come up with Melrose. We have always called it at our farm the ugly apple because it's not real pretty necessarily, but it's a fantastic tasting apple. It's a very hard, crunchy apple. That's my little spiel on it.
All right, and then we have 1 more question.
How many apples normally grow on one tree?
How many apples grow on one tree? Well, in our business, we never count apples because if you ever saw what's on those trees, you couldn't count them. But we look at how many pounds or how many bushels. In our business, in the apple business, we deal with bushels. And the average bushel weighs 40 pounds. So what we'll do is we'll say that how many apples are on a tree? Well, it depends on the size of the tree. The last tree that is left that my grandfather planted, which is a very big tree, we got, I think, 20 bushels of apples off that tree. That's 800 pounds of apples off of that one big tree. Some of our younger trees, the dwarf trees, they may only yield 30 pounds of apples. So they're a lot smaller. The trees are a lot smaller. They yield less, but normally what we do is we plant a lot more of those trees. That's a good question, but there's a lot of variability out there with what's available, what the tree is capable of doing.
And how many apples are in this bin that we're looking at?
This bin here has 18 bushels in it. That's the unit of measure that we deal with, are bushels. But this has 18 bushels in it. A bushel weighs about 40 pounds. So if my little calculator is working correctly, I think that's around 720 pounds of apples in this bin. Our small orchard this year already has harvested 43 or 44 bins of apples. Once again, we're pretty small. For us, this is a lot. This is a lot of work. By the way, all apples, people think sometimes that apples are picked by a machine. They're not. Our apples, every apple is handled 3 times. One time to pick it off the tree, one time when it goes through our washer and is graded, it has to be pulled off the grater and looked at. and then a third time when we package the apple, when we sell it up in the market and put it into bags. So think about that. Look real close at this bin. I have no idea how many apples are in there, but every one of these apples are handled 3 times. That's a lot of work.
Okay, so well, it is time to wrap up our second Google Handout of the year. Farm Bureau has provided you with a wonderful Apple Ag Mag that gives you some great information. Be sure to go to the suggested activities on the back page that give you some fun activities and websites you might want to visit. Be sure to take it home and read it and share it with your family members. Thank you all of our teachers and students who participated today, and Jennifer Barnett for her work scheduling and trial runs with the teachers. Thank you to Farm Bureau and everyone who made this experience possible, and special thanks goes out to our apple grower, Mr. Bruce Grayson, who joined us today. Teachers, be sure to go online and sign up for future Farmtastic Adventures. On November 20th, we're going to have the pork. December 11th, it's going to be trees. February 12th, beef. April 15th, we're going to be talking about water. And finally, on May 13th, we're going to have pizza pizzas. For more information, don't forget to go to agventures.hangout@gmail.com. And remember, agriculture produces the house you live in, the shirt you sit on, the clothes you wear, the food you eat, and the job where you work. See you next time and have a great day.